Hi, this is Atilla Yaşılada. You are watching Real Turkey channel. Turkey's municipal elections are over. Politics have calmed down somewhat. Now it's time to talk about the economy. If you are a Turkey follower, you might have noticed that Turkey's economy czar, Mr. Mehmet Şimşek, and the governor of the central bank, Mr. Fatih Karahan, have visited Washington in the occasion of IMF and World Bank spring meetings. Mr. Fatih Karahan, the central bank governor, was accompanied by his two associates, Professor Gerard Akçay and Mrs. Hatice Karahan. The meetings have been fruitful and productive, where the most important development was Mehmet Şimşek heralding a new economic austerity program. Dear viewers, if you are not an economist, don't worry about it. I'm going to keep this very non-technical. This is why I'm going to use words economic stabilization, austerity, belt tightening, alternatively, interchangeably. So sorry, my associates are eating muffins and my mouth is watering. Essentially, as you know, Turkey has two severe and cyclical problems: high inflation and currency instability. The second one is driven by the fact that Turkey consistently produces current account deficits. In other words, it pays out more in terms of imports and, services than it takes in terms of exports and tourism and transportation. So there's a foreign exchange shortage, which is usually solved by borrowing from abroad, which, as we would know from our own household budget, is unsustainable. You can't borrow forever. And Mr. Şimşek was appointed to the position of the Treasury and Finance Minister after May 2023 elections by President Erdogan to fix the economy, to lower inflation, and to deal with currency instability. In terms of the second, he has been relatively successful. Turkey is no longer at the precipice of another currency crisis. And just for those of you who are just concerned about the currency, I think Turkish lira will depreciate against the dollar very little, probably at the pace of 2% per month in the next 12 months or so. But battling inflation has not been successful. Though admittedly, this is not Mehmet Şimşek's fault. He had to allow the currency to depreciate after last May's elections simply because it was overvalued, and it was kept at a value that is artificially too high by burning the FX reserves of Turkish central bank. So the currency went down. Since Turkey imports a lot of goods and services, the prices of these increased, and Turkish inflation soared. 2, Mr. Erdogan spent the family's savings in the budget to win the May 2023 elections. The budget was in awful shape. So Mehmet Şimşek had to raise taxes. And of course, as you know, when you increase VAT or other consumption-related taxes, indirect taxes, the increase in taxes are reflected to prices, which causes a one-off inflation. That problem has been exacerbated by even more spending prior to the 31st of March local elections. Right now, all of these are over, but we're stuck with the entire nation believing that inflation is going to rise further. This is what we call sticky expectations. And Mr. Mehmet Şimşek, in fact, has said in one of his Washington, D.C. meetings that we have to convince the nation that inflation is going to go down. Otherwise, we cannot win the battle against it. The program must gain credibility. He is announcing a new program which will have more credibility, which will have 4 legs. I have mentioned higher interest rates, a relatively stronger currency or less weaker currency. 3, cutting budget deficits, government spending. 4, structural reforms. In May, we will see the new program, and the topic of this video is: what will the new program entail? How much will President Erdogan allow Mr. Mehmet Şimşek and Mr. Fatih Karahan to go in terms of stabilizing the economy, what measures are feasible, which ones aren't, and finally, can Mehmet Şimşek, even in the best case scenario, stabilize Turkish economy? Let's start immediately. Okay, A. As you watch this video, Turkish Central Bank's Monetary Policy Council will have met and kept the interest rates stable. But in May or in summer months, they'll have to raise the interest rate again. The current policy rate is 50%. I expect it to go up to at least 60%, but probably to 65%. Credit will become very scarce in Turkey. And that would, of course, reduce domestic demand. 2, yes, there will be budget cuts. Government spending will be cut in several ways. The most important of which is that government infrastructure spending will be reduced significantly. Projects which are not absolutely necessary or which have started but the construction company or the provider of the services has not done much work will be eliminated or funding will be cut off. Turkey's expansive state agencies and ministries will not be allowed to purchase new buildings or buy new cars. Believe me, Turkish civil servants are paid very little, and their most important perk is a very luxurious office coupled with a Mercedes or BMW, Beamer. This will have to go. 3, there will be a significant and severe crackdown on tax evasion, in particular on rents and those who only accept cash payments. These are all positive measures. Will they make a difference? Yes, somewhat. What Turkey really needs is to cut spending on civil servants and on the social security contributions, which will require structural reforms about which I will talk later. But, they're not going to happen as long as Erdogan is in power. You can reduce budget spending to the tune of perhaps 1% of GDP without raising taxes, which are inflationary, but that's the end of it. But there comes another factor into play. A lot of the budget deficits are now caused by earthquake-related spending. I've posted videos at the beginning of this year. Turkey's southern region was devastated with probably one of the biggest earthquakes of the 21st century, which cost, according to reliable estimates, at least $100 billion of damage to just the structures. And people there are not very rich. In any case, nobody has insurance, so the government has to shoulder most of the burden of rebuilding the area. These probably amount to 3% of the GDP per year. Now, Mehmet Şimşek has actually achieved something which has not been talked about significantly. He has persuaded World Bank to fund some of these projects to rebuild the area. Turkey will probably get an additional 20 billion in the next 3 years, which will go towards earthquake spending, and that would also reduce the domestic spending, the budget spending on earthquakes, which will also help. These 2 measures would probably reduce inflation somewhat. Currently, Turkish inflation CPI is roughly 70%. I think within 12 months, we will see 40%, but that's it. There's only so much you can do with budget spending cuts and higher interest rates. You can't do much more because the social costs would be unbearable. Thousands of companies which should survive because they're essentially profitable would go down because of a severe recession. Unemployment would soar, and people with low incomes or fixed salaries and pensions would be devastated. They would be reduced to poverty. So these measures need to be enhanced by structural reforms, by civil service reform, by reform to the Turkish judiciary, to cut down on corruption, to fight money laundering, to change the education system, to change the public procurement law, which is the biggest source of graft in Turkey because all the state and municipality tenders go to cronies of Mr. Erdogan. And that's where I become very pessimistic. As I explained in my previous video, one reason Erdogan lost local elections is because people are sick and tired of corruption. Then the watcher or the viewer would say, well, why doesn't he fix it? Simply because he is at the head of the corrupt regime. Remember, as in mafia, when there's a transaction, the boss takes the biggest cut. That's how things work in Turkey. I mean, small corruption and graft, yeah, I'm sure Erdogan doesn't know about it. But, when you're talking about millions of dollars, I'm fairly sure the bribe taking goes all the way up. In some sense, Erdogan built his regime and rebuilt his party around corruption. Now, I'm not claiming that he's taking bribes to enrich himself and his family, though there are allegations about that. But he's certainly using or funneling money from the private sector, from his cronies, to finance his party's election spending and part of the welfare spending. This is why Erdogan is so popular. If the budget doesn't have the money to help the poor, he calls his business friends and says, you got to employ these people, you got to build a school here, you got to provide some housing there at subsidized prices. And the business community gladly obliges because in return it gets real lucrative tenders. You can't change that system. And in the absence of that, structural reforms are impossible. You can't fix corruption and favoritism in the judiciary because Mr. Erdogan and his ally Bahçeli have built their regime around the control of the judiciary to suppress, oppress, repress dissidents. Once you fix the judiciary, Turkey becomes more liberal, freedoms are returned, and people start complaining about Mr. Erdogan and Mr. Bahçeli. This is why for the next 12 months I'm fairly optimistic. I think you will hear a lot of good news about Turkey. Foreign financial investors will flock, which would increase the value, real value of the Turkish lira. You would hear a lot about the Turkish stock exchange, how it booms, and how Turkish euro bonds, that's dollar-euro denominated bonds, and Turkish CDSs are becoming so popular. But unfortunately, these are all cyclical developments. Turkey will improve in the way that Atilla Yeşilada recovers from a hip surgery, and starts walking again, but he'll never be able to run. That's sad. Well, not in Atilla Yeşilada's case because he hates to run. This has been another broadcast by Real Turkey channel, and this is Atilla Yeşilada. I want to thank you for your delightful comments and for lovingly trolling me. Keep them coming. I'll promise to answer all of them. And if you like this, subscribe or share it with others. Goodbye now.